Lecture 8, Ambient Occlusion. This term should be known to you because it was previously used in renderers. You would render out an occlusion path for compositing to get more edge detail, but nowadays it's not needed because all the most modern ray tracers, they have occlusion built in and it just works out of the box. But for occlusion shader, it's still very interesting to get some details into your shaders, get more creases, maybe some more dirt. So an occlusion shader is still used in production nowadays. So let's hook up an ambient occlusion shader and talk about its parameters. So just connecting the out color to the demo shader, you can already see what it's outputting. You can see a nice fall off around occluded areas. It's a nice looking shader actually. So I think I won't go over the details in order. So I think the most important one is the clip, which is kind of a distance. So it looks for objects in a distance of 100 units. And whenever it finds something, it will contribute to the occlusion shading. So if that makes sense, and I put in a very low value, maybe a value of 1, you can see that only areas which are 1 unit away from each shading point get occluded. So the smaller this number, the more or the less contrast your occlusion will get, and the less detailed as well. So if I put a value of 0.1, 0.1, you should only get really crease details, really sharp edges, sharp lines where shapes meet together. So on default, depending on your scene scale, you should make this kind of realistic, but not too big. So if you would have a render of a car, for instance, you would make it the bounding box of the car maybe. So let's say maybe, and this is currently a meter scale. So for a car, you would put in maybe 5 meters in the far clip, which is, I think, 5,000. But for this scene, which is a head, which is maybe 50 centimeters, we can just put a far clip value of maybe just 50, and this should be good enough. And then you have the near clip, which is the same as a far clipping, but on the lower end. So I can say only start occluding when the ray is like further away than maybe 10 units, and then we ignore all the creases and we only get like a occlusion between 10 and 50 units in this case. But in most of the time, you should leave it at 0 because it doesn't really make sense to clip it lower on the lower end. And then you have samples, which is just eliminating the noise of the occlusion itself. A spread is more the same as we talked about in the curvature shader. It's more like something to clamp the normals the spread is just used to actually combine the result and make it more contrasty or less contrasty. So you can see in the example, if I would scrub it now, make the value lower, you can see it's getting more contrasty and more defined. So definitely values to play with, and the fall off behaves very similarly. And you can also change, in this shader, you can actually say which colors are what. So sometimes what I do, I just invert them, and then I get actually a mask of the occlusion itself. So now let's go a lower threshold, and then you can see exactly what I mean by this. Now we get actually a black and white mask of the edges which are being occluded. So this is very helpful if you want to apply this into a dirt shader or erosion shader. But you can also just make it some colored images if you want to have something very interesting. You can do that as well, like I don't know, something like this maybe, if you want to have some interesting results. What you can also do is you can plug noises into the black and white colors to get more like a dirt shader or something similar like that. So let's revert this back to the black and white, and I can show you a few more things. So if you tick invert normals, it's kind of like a curvature shader from a concave curvature shader, because it will trace from the inside of the geometry. So if I put in a low value, you can actually see, or it's actually hard to see, but you should be able to distinguish between the inside and the outside if I flip between those two guys. And the self only should be self-explanatory. It just means only occlude the same object and don't occlude any other objects in the scene. And I can actually demo you it if I unhide my sphere, which should be right on top of the scan. Let's see if I can actually move it closer. And then we can see what the occlusion mode does. So if I bring it into the face or the object, here you can see that the sphere is actually occluding now here between the objects. So if I tick self only, you should not get the occlusion from the sphere onto the head, and this is exactly what's happening. So if self is on, only itself will occlude and not other objects in this scene, which is very helpful. Let's see what else we need to cover in the occlusion shader. The trace sets is something you can say, hey, I want this object to only trace with a certain trace set, which you would define on each shape, and you can make it inclusive or exclusive by using this. If you would like to modulate some surface irregularities, you could also connect a bump shader to the occlusion to get a more interesting result. So if I quickly create a noise shader and I hook this up to a bump 2D shader and I connect the out color, just a luminance to a bump map and the bump map into a normal camera, you should already see a very interesting result if I play up the bump strength. You can now see that we get definitely some surface details just by connecting up the noise into the normal camera slot. And obviously you can control the noise with settings from the noise shader. We can bring up some more flow noise to this. And then obviously we can play around with the bump depth or the bump height to create a really broken up surface. And you can see how good this looks, as if it's made of brittle stone now, just by using a bump map to an occlusion shader. And you could use this to simulate lots of different things. So this sums it up for the occlusion shader, and I will be talking about more in depth about these noise shaders in the next lecture. So be sure to check this out.